than later, and we'll get started with Kristen really quick as I send Joe on his way and not unfortunately not kick Kristen out, which I almost did.
Yeah.
We want you here for the next half hour. This is our kickoff as night falls, at least for me here in DC. It's dusk, we're sun setting, and I can actually see a few bats outside my window because I'm high enough just above the trees. So we get to hear all about bats and your love of them. So we're going to go from tiny fish, freshwater fish, to sometimes tiny little flying mammals in the night sky. So we're going to hear a presentation from Kristen as she pulls it up, and then we'll get some questions. Please send them on over, and we'll make sure to ask Kristen all about bats after she gets done with her presentation. So fire away. It is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Wes, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about the wonderful world of bats, as I like to call it. Bats are an amazing group of animals, and I've spent my life dedicated to protecting them. And I'm here today to share some of the wonderful facts and also why we need bats and why bats help us. So to get started, I want to show the diversity of bats. So bats around the world are super diverse. There are over 1,400 species currently known around the world. And these pictures are just some of them. There are a huge range. You can see anything from the Honduran white bat in the top left that make little tents out of leaves. We have the commonly known as the Yoda bat in the middle right that looks like Yoda, and it was a recently discovered species a few years ago. We have pollinating bats, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, and a huge range of other bat species all around the world. Now, bats make up about 20% of all mammal species. So about 1 in every 5 mammal species is a bat. And they really are all over the world, except everywhere, every continent except Antarctica. So there's even bats in places like Alaska or Siberia, places that are cold and you might not think have bats, but they are there. So everywhere except Antarctica. And now, what about some of these bat myths? So we commonly hear some of these phrases that I will go over, but what are some of the myths and what's actually true about bats and how can they actually help us? How are they helping us in our everyday lives? So one of the common things that I hear a lot from people is that bats are just rodents with wings, or they're flying rats. While I also really love rats, bats are not rodents. So bats belong to their own order of mammals called Chiroptera, which in Latin means hand wing. And we can see on this diagram here of a human arm and hand and a bat arm and hand, we can see that the bats and the humans, we have the same bones that they do in their arms and hands. And the really cool part is if we look at the hand bones of the bat in the diagram, we can see the fingers. So we have this big thumb sticking out, and then we have the pointer finger, we have the middle finger, then we have the ring finger, and this really long pinky. So they actually fly with their hands and their arms, which is a really cool feat. And bat wings are actually really flexible. They're adapted to very maneuverable flight. And we've learned from bat wings how to adapt drones, for example, to fly even more maneuverably than they normally do. And so these bat bots or these bat drones are potentially good for looking in tight areas that other bigger drones couldn't get for things like search and rescue. So this bat bot is being developed. There's other ones out there, but again, we're learning from the bat's flight how to develop this technology. Now, also in addition to the comparison with rodents, bats also live exceptionally long lives for how big they are. So a lot of bat species live a really long time despite being pretty small. So if we think about a rat or another rodent that typically lives about 2 to 3 years, a bat of similar size can live up to 41 years or longer in the wild. And this is that we know of. So these bats, even though they have high metabolisms and they're very small, they still live a long time. And so there's actually research going into figuring out how can they live such long lives without getting cancer at high rates like we do. they have some sort of mechanism in their DNA that allows their DNA to get repaired and not get damaged over time as much as ours does, without also getting cancer. And so we can learn from bats to figure out, are there ways that we can boost our own cells or our own DNA so that we can live longer and healthier lives? So bats may be the key to the fountain of youth in the future. Now, what about that other myth that we hear a lot? Blind as a bat, right? That saying, it's everywhere. Well, bats are not blind. All bats have eyes, just like these ones here. You can see they have eyes and they all can see. But in addition, some bats, like this bottom one here, also use echolocation. So this echolocation, this sonar, is something that we have developed into technologies. Sonar for submarines, for example, but also on a more personal level, this echolocating cane, the smart cane, has been developed based off of bats' echolocation. When it actually sends out a vibration or a sound out into the environment, and it picks up what's around the person, and the cane then vibrates when there's some object nearby. And so again, using bats' echolocation, using their cool adaptations, we can develop these technologies to help us. Now, another of the myths we hear a lot is the vampire bat, or the vampire myth, that the bats are going to turn into a vampire or vice versa. There are 3 bat species in the world that eat blood. These are bats in Latin America. They're the 3 vampire bat species. But we can even learn from the vampire bats. So they have an anticoagulant in their saliva, which basically means it's a compound in their saliva that helps blood continue to flow when they eat. And we're looking at this, people are looking at this to think about, can we develop a medicine from that compound to treat things like stroke, which is caused by blood clots? So this actually has a name. It's called Draculin, is the original one developed. And there's more research into going in how can this be used, again, to treat people with strokes. So of the bat species around the world, only 3 eat blood. So what do the rest eat? Well, we have the insectivores. So about 70% of bats around the world eat insects. So they're eating things like moths. You can see in this one has a nice juicy moth. Katydids, cockroaches even. Some bats eat cockroaches. Mosquitoes that we don't want to have around. So these bats that are eating insects are really important to helping keep these insect populations under control. Of course, we need insects. Insects are part of the food chain. They're a really important part of ecosystems, but the bats help keep them at levels that are decent. So to give a little bit of perspective about some of these bats that are eating insects and how we would have to eat to be like a bat. Some of these bats can eat up to their body weight in insects in one night, and that's just flying around. So if we had to eat enough quarter-pounder hamburgers in one night to be like a bat, how many would we have to eat? Now, I won't make you go through the math. It is a Friday night after all, but we'd have to eat about 600 hamburgers, give or take, depending on your weight. But 600 hamburgers is a lot. Even more than like 4 for me is a lot. So these bats are out there eating these pest insects. And this is a video you can actually see. We can see these bats going out on the landscape in Texas, for example, and going out and eating insects. So we're going to watch this and we're going to see, this is Bracken Cave in San Antonio, Texas. We're going to see here a cloud starts forming. And it may look like a rain cloud, but in fact, those are bats spreading out over the landscape. And there's these other smaller caves nearby that have bats. And these bats, again, are going out over the landscape. They're going out over places like cotton fields and cornfields and eating millions and millions of insects every night. And a paper in 2011 estimated that just in the US alone, the bats' pest control services to the US agricultural industry is about $23 billion a year. So these bats are going out and eating things like the moths that destroy cotton crops, the moths that destroy corn and pecans. So if you like any of these things, if you like wearing a cotton t-shirt, or you like eating corn or pecan pies, I love pecan pies, you should thank a bat, because these bats are doing a really important pest control service and saving us money at the grocery store and saving farmers money in their farms. Now, not all bats eat insects. A large proportion also eat nectar, so they're nectarivores. And we can see this one's about to eat nectar from a cactus, and it goes up to the flower and they get covered in pollen when they're eating the nectar. And so bats are really important pollinators of over 300 different plants around the world. Some of these are things that we eat or encounter every day. Bananas, if you like bananas. What about mangoes, avocados, chocolate? I know I'm a huge fan of chocolate. Even tequila that is made from agaves that bats pollinate. So again, without bats, we wouldn't have these things as part of our everyday lives. And again, with the adaptations that these bats have to do these things, some of these bats have really long tongues. So we can see the pink tongue coming out of this bat's mouth. And that really long tongue helps them get deep into the flower to get the nectar. And when we zoom in on these tongues, some of these bats that eat nectar have these papilla that kind of look like hairs on their tongue. So this is an image of a bat's tongue really close up. And they use these papilla to lap up the nectar. So I'm going to show you a video here. We can see the bat getting its head in and drinking the nectar. And you can see the little papilla are erected. They're standing on end. And there its head is again. And we'll see it even in slow motion. So there's the papilla. Looks kind of creepy, but I think they're cool. And then we can see when they go in, it pulls up the nectar. You can see it grabs it and then it pulls it up without the bat's actual mouth having to get in there. And so with these papilla, they can get really far and lap up nectar. And a cool thing about these tongues is that they're being used as models for little surgical robots that can be used for things like doing angioplasties to open up arteries that are clogged. So how can we develop little robots that are based on the bat's tongue that swell up when they go inside an artery, just like the bat's tongue swells up to get nectar? So again, medical advances, bats are helping with those. Now, what about frugivores? These are the fruit-eating bats. So we have bats around the world that eat things like figs, like this bat has in its mouth. And when they eat the fruit, they suck the juice out, they squeeze it really hard, and they suck the juice out, and then they spit out the rest of the fruit. And what is in the rest of that fruit? Seeds. So the seeds then regrow into new plants and help regenerate places like tropical rainforests. And bats are really important seed dispersers because they can fly really far distances. They can often carry seeds farther than a lot of other animals would. And so again, they're replanting different areas that may have been degraded from things like logging or clearing for agriculture. Unfortunately, bats do have it kind of difficult. With the way they reproduce, most bat species only have one baby or one pup per year. They only reproduce once a year and only have one baby. There are some species that have twins or triplets, but for the most part, these bats are only having one baby, which you can imagine if something happens to a colony of bats, it's going to take a long time for them to recover. And so this means that about 13% of species worldwide are listed as either endangered, critically endangered, or threatened. And another 16% approximately are listed as data deficient, which means we just don't have a lot of information about those species. So about a third, about 30% of bat species around the world are under some sort of threat or could be under threat, and we just don't know it yet. So I always like to talk about what we can all do to help bats. It sounds kind of all doom and gloom, but there are things that we can do in our own backyards to help bats. So one of the things that I think is really fun to do and is a great way to help bats is to put up a bat house. So you might have seen these bat houses like the ones in these pictures. You can put them up on poles or on the side of a building like on a house here. And the idea is that these houses will provide roosting habitat for the bats because bats tend to like to move around a bit. They might need multiple roosts in a season. And so having multiple options, multiple houses or trees or other places to go will help them. And if you're interested in bat houses, there's a lot of great resources online. Bat Conservation International and Bat Conservation and Management have really great resources about where to put up a bat house, how to paint it, what it should look like, where it should go. So definitely check them out if you are interested. Now, another way, if you are a gardener, I know a lot of people love to garden, is you can plant a night garden that could be a bat garden. So even if you don't have those pollinating bats that are drinking nectar from flowers in your area, you can still plant night blooming flowers that will attract nocturnal insects that the insectivorous bats can then eat. So you'll have your own little ecosystem in your backyard. You'll be providing food for the bats in your area, and you'll get to see all of the awesome flowers that come with the bat garden. So a lot of these flowers tend to be white flowers or light colored flowers, but there's, again, a lot of great information online about doing gardening for bats. Of course, there's a lot of great bat organizations out there. These are just some. I listed some of the bat organizations, but there are many more that do a lot of research and conservation work around the world, and also education work, which is really important, especially for species like bats that are often misunderstood. So definitely check out some of these organizations, join or donate, or just learn from their websites about bats. Now, if there are any kids out there, I did this in 3rd grade, where we as a class adopted a puffin, and you could do something similar with your class or your troop or your family. You can adopt a bat. Now, you don't actually get a bat. You can't really have a bat for a pet. But what you do get with these organizations is you get information about either the species that you're helping or about the individual bat that your donation goes towards helping. And so again, I've listed some of the organizations that do this, and it's a really fun birthday present or class project. And I think one of the things that we can all do, no matter where we are or who we are, is we can all tell our family and friends how neat and how important bats really are to the ecosystems, the environment, and to our economies and to our everyday lives. Bats are fascinating animals. There's a huge diversity out there. And without them, we wouldn't have some of the things that we use in our everyday lives. So go out and share the wonderful world of bats with others, tell everyone how neat they are, and help protect bats. Now, I know this was a short talk, but feel free to reach out if you ever have bat questions or want to chat bats. I'm always welcoming people to get in touch. I'm on social media if you want to learn more about bats, and thank you. Well, I think we have some time for questions now too.
We definitely do have time for questions. So one thing that I have to say is I was a huge bat fan before. Now I'm even a bigger one because I realize bats make my summer fun. They keep away mosquitoes. They give me tequila and chocolate. Mm-hmm. So really,
what more
summer
could you need,
is
right?
Thanks to that. Right, exactly. Oh, bananas are good. I guess I need to balance that out with something healthy.
For sure.
So I have to say that now I'm a bigger bat fan than I ever was.
Yes.
So I've got a couple questions coming in. And of course, you know, the one thing that kind of caught my attention was when we saw that swarm of bats moving through. How far can some bats migrate? Their ranges, like, are they super like close in, or do they go really far and wide?
Yeah, so it depends on the species. So again, we have huge ranges, but so some bats like to stay pretty local. They'll be like foraging within like a mile of their roost area. But some bats, like the Mexican long-nosed bat that I work with in Mexico, can migrate over 700 miles.
Oh, wow.
They do these long-distance migrations, some bats do. Even on a nightly basis, some bats can forage 20, 30 miles from their roosting site to go forage on things.
Little guys to go that far.
Right. I mean, they're pretty small, and it's amazing how they can do it. But yeah, they can migrate, and they're pretty fascinating with their flight, like we saw in that video.
Well, I guess that's why they're eating the equivalent of 600 hamburgers a day.
Exactly. All that.
I mean, I do 6,000 steps, and I definitely need like a burger or two. So I can only imagine.
Exactly.
And in the spirit of having my summer be better, this is kind of a selfish question. If I wanted to build, let's say, a bat house, what are some tips to make a good one?
Yeah, so definitely check out those websites, Bat Conservation International and Bat Conservation and Management. They have a lot more in depth, but some of the kind of basics, you want it up pretty high. Okay. So they recommend at least 12 feet from the bottom of the bat house to the ground, because bats need to swoop. They can't really, most bats can't take off, from the ground. So they need to be able to have room to swoop without hitting the ground.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the higher the better, 15 feet or higher is even better. You want it to get decent amount of sun. So the kind of general recommendation is about 6 hours of sun per day. Morning sun is great if you can. They like it pretty warm inside the bat box. Painting, again, the color or the shade that you paint, it depends on where you live and what region you're in. But again, check out the websites. They have a lot more detailed information.
Interesting. That's interesting that the colors make a difference. What is it about the colors that, like, so I can't paint them all black or red?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, because with it, so the different colors absorb different amounts of heat. So if you put up a black bat house in Texas, you're going to cook those bats in there. So you don't want to do that. But alternatively, if you put up a white bat house in Alaska, it's probably not going to get warm enough. So you need to adjust based on where you live. And there's actually a cool map that BCI has on their website about where, what color you should paint it based on where you live, at least in the US.
Yeah. And another thing you just said that surprises me, and I know you mentioned it earlier, Alaska. How do these little tiny flying things live that far in the cold?
They're fascinating. I don't know a ton about Alaska bats, but there are 5 species that are known to be in Alaska, which is amazing. We're still learning about where they live. They can roost in root snags of trees.
Wow.
Yeah, so really kind of creative areas that you might not think of because there's just not a ton of roosting sites there. Yeah.
So I know that the bats are saving my summer, which is vitally important, and saves me money on citronella and all these other things because there's less mosquitoes. Also, it costs me more money because there's Patron. We'll talk. That's a conversation later. So with all that work that they do to create food for us and all these other things, is there a way to the value they add to the economy?
Yeah, so that study from 2011 was a big science paper, and they published that they estimated it was between 3.7 billion to 50 something billion dollars a year in the US alone.
I was just saying.
And that's just from eating the insects, the pests, because when there's fewer pest insects around the crops, the farmer has to spray less pesticide, right? So they have to use less money to keep those pest insects under control because the bats are doing it for them. And so in that way, it saves them money and it saves everyone money in the long run.
And it's also better and it's also much better for the environment, all the runoff. So it's got such a tack-on effect. The bats those little guys are doing so much work for us.
Exactly. And even just being there. So a lot of bats, they don't necessarily have to eat the insects. A lot of times bat activity, the insects can usually hear the bat echolocation and they'll hide or they'll reduce their activity when they hear a bat around. So even if the bats aren't directly eating the insects, they can still dampen the effect of those pest insects by just being there.
So they're scare bats.
Exactly.
Just having them around is I don't want to be, nope, I'm good. I don't want to go over to that field over there. So that is wild to think that they're doing so much work for farmers and the food that we want. So I imagine you've seen a lot of bats in your time. I'm not going to ask numbers because I imagine it's a lot of bats. But what is there a bat that's I guess your bucket list bat that
my
you
bucket
really
list.
Want to see?
I have 2. One is the spotted bat, which is in the US, kind of the western part of US and Canada and Mexico. They kind of look like cows. They're black and white and have black spots, but they have these ginormous ears. And they use those ears to pounce on and listen for insects and chase around moths. And they're just really fascinating bats, I think. And the other one is the false vampire bat in Latin America. It looks scary, but it's not. But it is one of the carnivorous bats that I didn't talk about. That there are some bats that eat things like other mammals, birds, frogs, fish, even other bats. Some of these bats eat other bats.
Oh, wow.
So I'd love to see that one.
So really, bats are kind of, kind of tough. I feel but in a good way. They're adaptable. They can be anywhere, and they do so much for us. So really, I'm gonna lean in and say my favorite animal might be a bat.
Oh yes. Well, I agree. I can't argue with that.
It's just so amazing to think of what they do. The fact that they've done that, and so we said how many 100 Or no, you said 1,000, 1,100.
1,411 as of today, I believe. It's
I clearly
constantly
took
changing
notes.
though.
You can tell I was very intent. I just know there were a lot of bats.
Yep.
So is there a place where there's like more bats than others, and like where would that be?
Yeah, so the tropics, the places that have in the tropical areas, I believe Indonesia is the country that has the highest diversity with around 219, 220 species, which is
Oh, wow.
Mexico has a huge diversity also. I believe it's over 150 in that range. The US has 47 species. So yeah,
not
like
too bad, not too bad, not too bad.
We're not doing too bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, those really kind of those hot spots of diversity that you hear about, the tropical areas, those tend to have the most diversity. Asia, Southeast Asia, a lot of diversity, and in Africa too.
Well, I mean, I know Indonesia itself is just a hot spot for like biodiversity in general.
Yes.
And as now a bat lover extraordinaire, like you've won me over, what's the one thing I can tell my friends to be like, so I love bats because, or like one or two sentences that'll change their mind. What can I say?
That's so hard. I think with just the everyday things, like, do you like chocolate? Do you like mangoes? Do you like bananas? I mean, you're gonna find somebody. I know some people don't like chocolate, and I'm suspicious of those folks, but you gotta find somebody that has some connection to bats. Everybody has a connection to bats. They're just so beneficial to our everyday lives. So yeah, I would talk about that with your friends.
In a very human way, it's all about us. Like, how does
I know, right?
And
bats are really cool. I hope they should be protected because they're cool too.
Well, they're cool, and
exactly.
we get tequila. Exactly. I mean, this seems like a no-brainer here.
For sure.
So, how did, and I asked Joe this question too, what got you into bats? Because I feel like as a kid, like bats are like creepy and like I don't want to.
Yeah, actually, that's the opposite for me. So when I was growing up, I always rooted for the underdog. I always rooted for whichever like football team was like the losing team, or the
you should have been
favorable. I was not a sports person, but I always did that. Same thing with like snakes, spiders, bats. A lot of times people don't like these things, so I was very drawn to them. And I actually did a bat house project when I was in 6th grade for my Girl Scout Silver Award project. So it's really never too early to get started.
As someone who like loves to root for the underdog, I kind of feel you. So Joe, I gotta say, what are your feelings on bats? You know, do you like chocolate? Like, can we keep this conversation? I mean, I want to know.
I mean, even without the chocolate, I think bats are pretty awesome. Yeah. I lived in Australia for a year. I've told Kristen this story, and I landed at the Sydney airport, stepped out of the airport after clearing customs, and the first thing I saw was a flying fox with like an over a meter wingspan. It was
that's so cool.
That's different.
I also noticed how you dodged the chocolate question. We'll touch on this later offline. I'm going to assume good things because you also love bats. I gotta say, this was really fun to get to see you, Kristen, and catch up and talk bats and chocolate and everything else amazing. So until the next time you're in DC or we get to hang out virtually again, it was awesome to spend time chatting about bats. And Joe, I feel like I'm going to turn this over for the rest of the night for you now that we've gone from under fresh water to the skies and everything in between.
That's right. We're going to wrap up with a little big cat action and then a little trip to the Galapagos before we wind down.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. This was fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Wes, thank you for jumping in for an awesome host jam session.